So what I want to cover in this lesson is just take a look at the files we've got and to actually run our application. Now we've got our 4 projects inside VS Code, we've got 3 class libraries, and our class libraries don't do very much. All we've got is a demo class, which is nothing. It's got no logic inside there at all. So these are just example classes, and we also have our CS_proj file, which contains information about the project itself. Now each project in our class library is going to target the NetStandard 2.0 framework, and it's also going to include a reference, if we have one, for what projects it depends on. Now in the case of our persistence project, that's our domain, and if we look at our domain CS_proj, well, this doesn't depend on any other projects. Our application project is going to have 2 dependencies, the domain and persistence. And our API project is where all of the interesting stuff is going on at the moment. And our API project contains the files we need to actually run and start our application. Now every .NET application needs to have a program.cs class, and inside this particular class is a main method. And when we run our application, this is the method that's executed to actually start our application. Now inside this main method we make a call to create web host builder, which then builds and runs our application. And this particular method calls into another method called create default builder. Now this creates a new instance of our web host builder class with some pre-configured defaults. And those pre-configured defaults, in fact we can go and take a look and click on go to definition, because this will give us more details about what's going on here. And if we take a look at what's going on inside the create default builder class, we can see what's happening inside the remarks here. And one of the things it's going to do is use Kestrel as the web server and configure it using the application's configuration providers. Now our application configuration provider is this startup class, which we'll take a look at very shortly. What this is also going to do is load up our configuration, and there's a number of configuration files that this create default builder is going to look in to get our configuration from the application. And there's an app settings.json and an app settings whatever the environment is that we're running in .json as well. And if we look over in our Solution Explorer, we can see 2 files here, one called appsettings.development.json and the other one called appsettings.json. And both of these contain configuration for our application. Now at the moment there's not a lot in them, and all the details that are in there at the moment are the logging level. And in the case of appsettings.json, this is what would be used if we're running in either production or development mode, and it just has a setting inside there for logging. And then we also have a more environment specific app settings file, and this one overwrites what's contained in our app settings.json with more specific settings for when we're running in development. And what this is doing is making our logging much more verbose once we're in development. Because when we're developing an application, we always want lots of information about what's going on. So I'll just go back into the definition again, back to where I was, and we read from our configuration files, our app settings files. There can also be configuration contained in other areas as well, such as user secrets, and we'll discuss this kind of thing later on. And this also configures a logger factory so that we can utilize logging throughout our application as well and add custom logging as and when we need it. So that's what's going on in our create default builder, and it also uses our startup class for additional configuration for our application. So let's take a look at the startup.cs next. And inside this particular file, what we have is we have a constructor that injects the configuration into our startup class so that we can make use of it. And then what we also have is 2 methods, configure services and configure. Configure services is our dependency injection container. The way that we utilize classes in other aspects or other areas of our application is to use dependency injection. And anything that we add inside this services container will then be available for other parts of our application, and we can inject these services into our other application code. Now, I'm not going to get into detail about all of dependency injection and everything around that. We'll come on to that later. But just for now, this is our dependency injection container. What we also have inside here is a configure method. And this method gets called by the runtime, and we use this method to configure the HTTP request pipeline. Now, there's a couple of things going on in here at the moment. First of all, we check to see if we're running in development mode. If we are running in development mode, then it uses something called the developer exception page. And if we have an exception in our application, then it returns a developer-friendly exception page with a lot of information about what happened. And we only use that when we're running in developer mode, or in the developer environments. Now, we also have a couple of security-related things going on in here as well. First of all, we've got this app use HSTS, and this adds middleware for using HSTS, which adds the strict transport security header. Now, this is a web security policy mechanism, and it allows web servers to declare that our browser should only interact with it using HTTPS connections, and never via an HTTP connection. And this is only going to be used when we're running in production mode. It wouldn't affect us when we're running in development mode. We also have app use HTTPS redirection as well. And what this is going to do is anytime that we hit an HTTP endpoint, it's going to automatically redirect us to HTTPS. Now, because this is a training course and we haven't actually written any code, and using HTTPS in development requires the use of self-signed certificates, and self-signed certificates are never trusted by browsers. You always have to work around and add these self-signed certificates into your trusted root store. What I want to do now is simply turn off the HTTPS in our application. And there's a couple of places we need to do this. First of all, I'm going to comment out this line. And because I've commented out this line, I'm also going to comment out the use HSTS inside our else statement here. And what I also need to do is to prevent our application from starting up on an HTTPS port, is also go into another file inside Solution Explorer, inside Properties, inside Launch Settings.json. And what we want to do is just remove, inside the API section, inside the application URL, we're just going to remove the HTTPS localhost 5001. So the only port we're going to run our application from is HTTP localhost 5000. And we can also see here that we're going to run our application in development mode as well. Now, I've only done this, and it's perfectly fine to develop your application using HTTPS and localhost 5001, and it's also fine to redirect to the HTTPS URL. The only problem is that it does give us an issue with self-signed certificates, and they can be tricky to work around for different operating systems and different browsers as well. So just for development purposes, I'm just going to turn that off. And we will of course publish our application securely. And we'll come on to that much later on, but for now I do highly recommend, just to avoid any potential self-signed certificate problems, you turn off the HTTPS redirection, HSTS, and just remove the HTTPS from the application URL here as well. Now what we're going to do when we start our application is we're going to take a look at hitting our API endpoints. And what I want to talk about next is another part of our API project, and that's what's inside this controllers folder. And we'll take a look at API controllers Next.